An elderly woman discovered that a boy was stealing from the market every day. One day, she followed him and discovered. Mrs. Vera adjusted her glasses as she walked slowly between the shelves of the little market. It was her daily routine. She would leave the house right after breakfast, buy fresh bread, some vegetables, and that little slice of cornbread she insisted on taking home as a treat for herself. At 70 years old, Mrs. Vera's life was predictable, meticulously organized, every detail carefully calculated to fill the silence of her empty house. As she walked down the cookie aisle, she noticed a swift shadow. It was a boy, thin, with disheveled hair and large dark eyes that shone with a mix of hunger and alertness. He seemed to be about 10, maybe 11, and he kept close to the shelves, slipping from one aisle to another with quick, silent steps. Mrs. Vera observed him over her glasses, her curiosity growing with each second. He stopped in front of the fruit section, and she noticed his small, dirty hands hesitate before he picked up an apple and hid it under his worn-out shirt. Shortly after, he grabbed a packet of cookies and quickly stuffed it into his pocket. His movements were so fast and calculated that they went almost unnoticed by the other customers, and even by Mr. Amilcar, the owner of the little market, who was distractedly organizing the cash register. At first, Mrs. Vera felt a pang of indignation. Theft, whatever the reason, had always seemed wrong and unacceptable to her. Raised in a poor but honest family, she had learned early on that dignity was the most valuable asset. But there was something in the boy's look, in the way he shrank at every noise or movement around him, that made her indignation fade, giving way to a disconcerting feeling of compassion. What kind of child would do this so often and with such skill, she thought. And where are his parents? She tried to focus on her shopping, but her eyes kept returning to the boy. He looked at the products not with the gleam of a mischievous child, but with a strange urgency, as if it was more than a mere impulsive act. It seemed a matter of survival. Seeing the boy leave through the market's door, Mrs. Vera felt a mix of unease and curiosity wash over her. It was as if the presence of that little thief had disrupted the calm of her routine. As she walked to the checkout, a decision began to form in her mind. Something needed to be done. At that moment, she realized that her, until then ordinary, day was taking a new direction. The next day, Mrs. Vera returned to the little market earlier than usual. Her heart beat faster than she'd like to admit, as if something was driving her to act, something she didn't fully understand yet. As soon as she entered the door, she saw the tired look of Mr. Amilcar, the owner, who was arranging boxes of vegetables with a bored expression. "Good morning, Mr. Amilcar," she greeted in her usual tone, but there was a seriousness in her voice. "Good morning, Mrs. Vera. Got your fresh bread ready," he replied, forcing a cordial smile. It was clear he regarded her as a loyal customer. But today, Mrs. Vera wasn't interested in bread or small talk. She placed the basket on the counter, and after a sigh, decided to be direct. "Yesterday, I noticed a boy here. Small, thin, about 10 years old. Have you seen him before?" Mr. Amilcar's face twisted with immediate displeasure. "Oh, that kid. He shows up almost every day. Always lurking, fiddling with the shelves. I've told him off countless times, but he never takes heed. He's probably one of those street kids, ill-mannered, who only know how to steal." Mrs. Vera felt a slight discomfort with his harsh words. She knew Mr. Amilcar to be a strict, pragmatic man, but the coldness with which he spoke of a child deeply disturbed her. "But have you ever tried talking to him? Asking why he does it?" she asked, probing a bit further, her tone gentle, almost conciliatory. "Talk? To a little thief?" "Mrs. Vera, with all due respect, kids like that don't change. I've lost hope in trying to educate them these days. They just want the easy life to take. What's not theirs," he shrugged. Look, if you want, I'll call the police next time and be done with it. Maybe that'll scare him enough." Mrs. Vera closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the urge to respond more sharply. Mr. Amilcar's unyielding mindset, full of suspicion and bitterness, seemed so distant from the reality she was beginning to glimpse for that boy. "I don't think it's that simple, Mr. Amilcar. Sometimes people steal out of necessity, out of desperation," she murmured, more to herself than to him. Mr. Amilcar let out a bitter laugh. "Necessity? That kid's just cunning, Mrs. Vera. Be careful not to be fooled by an angelic face." She picked up the bread and some fruit she had already separated, without replying. As she left the market, a quiet determination began to grow in her chest. She knew she couldn't simply ignore what she had seen. She needed to understand the truth about that boy and the reasons for his actions. Mrs. Vera spent the rest of the day thinking, recalling the times when her own life hadn't been easy, the hardships she'd faced with her limited resources. Even in poverty, she remembered how her mother always found ways to teach them the value of honesty. However, she knew that every situation was unique and that not everyone had the same opportunities or support. So, she decided that the next day she would observe the boy more closely, and, if possible, follow him. The idea made her feel nervous and strangely alive, as if she were on the verge of uncovering a mystery. More than that, she felt called to do something important and meaningful. As she adjusted her glasses and crossed the street back home, a quiet prayer escaped her lips. "Lord, if I'm getting into something I shouldn't, stop me. But if not, then give me the strength to help." That night, before going to sleep, Mrs. Vera knew it wasn't just a matter of curiosity that awaited her the next day. It was a step towards something she didn't fully understand yet, but which her heart already sensed. The following day, Mrs. Vera arrived at the little market early, her heart racing. She tried to convince herself that her presence there was merely routine, but she knew something more awaited her. She wandered through the shelves, pretending to choose products, while her sharp eyes scanned the surroundings. And then, as if in answer to her wish, the boy appeared. He entered through the side of the door, with quick and silent steps. He wore the same worn-out and faded shirt, and up close, Mrs. Vera could see he was even thinner than she'd imagined. His cheekbones were sunken, and there were dark circles under his eyes, which seemed to assess every movement around him. Without wasting any time, the boy repeated the routine that Mrs. Vera had already observed. He slipped down the cookie aisle, grabbed a small package, and tucked it under his shirt, adjusting the fabric to disguise the bulge. He passed by the fruit section, where he quickly chose 2 apples and placed them in his pocket. In seconds, he was already heading toward the exit, his eyes always alert to the possible glances of other customers. Mrs. Vera waited a moment before following him, making sure no one would notice. With firm but discreet steps, she left the market and watched the boy turn the corner with agility, as if he knew every inch of the neighborhood. He walked quickly, dodging people, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Mrs. Vera followed him, keeping a safe distance but without losing sight of him. The boy seemed to know exactly where he was going. He passed through a narrow street, then another, and then entered a dark alley, flanked by old, worn buildings. Mrs. Vera hesitated, feeling her heart race. It was an area of the city she avoided, known for harboring people of all sorts, many living on the fringes. But determined, she pressed on, feeling the weight of each step. When the boy disappeared through a side door of an old building, Mrs. Vera stopped a few meters away, summoning her courage. The building looked abandoned, with broken windows and walls covered in faded graffiti. She looked around, and seeing that no one was watching, she approached a broken window where a thin, torn curtain fluttered in the wind, offering glimpses of the interior. Through the dirty glass, Mrs. Vera saw the boy enter a small, dark room. In the corner, on a thin and stained mattress, lay a young woman, frail and pale, her eyes half open, as if she were awake but too weak to move. Beside her, a very young girl, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the morning chill, watched her brother with large, hungry eyes. "Look, Mom," said the boy in a tired but tender voice. He took the cookies and apples out of his shirt and placed them next to his mother, who looked at him with a weak smile, as if each word was an effort. "My boy, you always take care of us," she murmured, her voice hoarse, stroking his face with a trembling hand. The little girl reached out, grabbing one of the apples hurriedly, as if afraid it would disappear. She bit into the fruit with such voracity that Mrs. Vera felt a lump in her throat. The children ate with a silent desperation, a painful contrast to the tender glances they exchanged. The mother, barely strong enough to sit up, thanked her son with an almost solemn affection, as if he were the only thing keeping her alive. The boy, in turn, looked at her with an expression of responsibility that no child his age should bear. Mrs. Vera backed away from the window, her heart heavy. The image of that family, trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair, deeply disturbed her. She thought about her own life, the difficult days of her youth, but nothing she had experienced could compare to what that mother and her children were going through. And the boy, stealing to support his family, was not a bad-mannered kid, as Mr. Amilcar had said. He was, in fact, a small silent hero, fighting to keep his family alive. Mrs. Vera stood there, motionless in the alley, for a few minutes, trying to process everything she had seen. She felt a mix of sadness, indignation, and a growing desire to act. She knew that somehow she needed to help that family. What she had just witnessed was more than a simple personal tragedy. It was a cry for help. Not knowing exactly how she would do it, but determined not to ignore the silent plea she had witnessed, Mrs. Vera left the alley and returned home, her mind buzzing with plans. That night, Mrs. Vera barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the boy bringing food to his sick mother and hungry sister came back to her mind, like a scene etched in fire. The boy's weary but determined expression seemed to haunt her heart. The next morning, unable to focus on her own routine, she decided she needed to see the situation more closely to understand what was really happening with that family. She brought a bag with some bread, cheese, and a bottle of milk. Simple items, but ones that could make a huge difference for them. When she arrived at the abandoned building, she hesitated for a moment in front of the side door, but, gathering her courage, she knocked softly. From the other side, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and the boy's face appeared, his eyes wide with surprise at seeing Mrs. Vera. He looked even thinner in the dim hallway light, and his gaze held a mixture of astonishment and distrust. "Hello, dear," said Mrs. Vera, trying to make her voice sound gentle and reassuring. "Oh, I brought a little food. May I come in for a moment?" He hesitated, casting a quick glance into the apartment, as if fearing what his mother would say. But after a few seconds of silence, he opened the door a bit wider and nodded, inviting her inside. Mrs. Vera crossed the threshold and was immediately hit by a strong smell of mold and dampness. The place was small, dark, and poorly maintained, with peeling walls and a stained floor. There was an old mattress on the floor, covered with a thin blanket, where a very young woman, frail in appearance, lay, breathing with difficulty. Beside her, the little girl Mrs. Vera had seen before clutched a worn rag doll, holding it tightly as if the doll could protect her from all the surrounding evils. The woman lifted her head when she saw Mrs. Vera, her pale, worn face illuminated by curiosity and a touch of shame. She tried to sit up, but weakness held her down, and her arms trembled with the effort. Please don't get up, Mrs. Vera said, approaching calmly. I'm Mrs. Vera. I live nearby. I saw Gabriel. Your son, I assume? Yesterday, and, well, I just wanted to help if you'll allow me. The woman looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, and soon her eyes filled with tears. My name is Sarah, she murmured, her voice hoarse and weak. I'm sorry for what Gabriel has done. He didn't want to. I just don't have another choice. Mrs. Vera knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on hers, which was as cold as marble. You don't need to apologize, dear. I know you're just trying to survive. What matters now is that you all get well. Gabriel stood by his mother's side, looking at Mrs. Vera with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. He seemed torn between shame and relief, as if he was glad to finally have someone there, but also fearful of what that presence might mean. Gabriel, you take very good care of your mother and sister, Mrs. Vera said, looking at him with affection. You are a brave and strong boy. It's not easy for someone your age to carry such responsibility. He lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if a part of his armor had cracked. I didn't have a choice, ma'am. No one wants to help. I tried asking for food, but nobody wants to give. So, I do what I can. Sarah closed her eyes, visibly embarrassed, and squeezed her son's hand. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Vera, she murmured. I didn't want him to go through this. I had a job until a few months ago, but since I got sick, I can't get out of bed properly. And their father, he left us. Her voice faltered, and she lowered her face, shame evident in every line. Mrs. Vera pressed her lips together, holding back the tears that began to form in her eyes. The pain of this woman was palpable, a pain she felt as if it were her own, perhaps because it reminded her of the difficult times she too had faced. But here was a young mother, with no one to support her, depending on a 10-year-old boy for survival. You don't have to go through this alone anymore, Sarah, Mrs. Vera said firmly, trying to convey the security that the woman seemed to desperately need. We'll find a way to help you. You and your children don't deserve to live like this. Gabriel watched every word, his face expressionless, but his eyes held a glimmer of hope that he tried to hide, as if afraid to believe. Mrs. Vera stood up and took the bag she had brought. Here, I brought some food for you. It's just a start, but I'll do what I can to help in other ways. Sarah took the bag with trembling hands, looking at the bread and milk with silent gratitude that seemed to overflow in tears. Thank you so much, Mrs. Vera. I don't even know what to say. You don't need to say anything, replied Mrs. Vera, caressing the little girl's face, who looked at her with wide eyes, as if she had never seen someone so kind. Just accept it, and I promise that from today on, you won't be alone. I will look after you. Those words seemed simple, but for Sarah and her children, they sounded like a miracle. Mrs. Vera knew that what she had just promised would demand much from her, perhaps even more than she was prepared to give. But at that moment, she felt that her life had gained a new purpose, a reason that made every beat of her heart meaningful. When she returned home that afternoon, Mrs. Vera felt exhausted, but her heart was restless. She sat at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap, her gaze lost in the window facing the street. The vision of Sarah and the children, that dark and suffocating apartment, seemed etched in her mind like an indelible scar. For the first time in many years, she felt that her calm and comfortable routine had been shaken irreversibly. My God, what can I do for them? She murmured softly. She remembered her difficult childhood, the financial struggles, the days her mother stayed up late, sewing to earn a little money. Mrs. Vera never forgot the pride and resilience her mother showed, even in the worst moments, and it was with these examples that she had built her own life. She knew that dignity was sacred, something people fought to preserve even in the greatest adversities. And now, recalling Sarah and Gabriel's faces, she saw in them a similar spark, a will to maintain dignity even when everything seemed lost. However, she found herself in a dilemma. She knew that stealing was wrong, a violation of values she had always held dear, but she couldn't ignore that family's desperation. She felt torn between what was right and what was just between morality and compassion. How could she help without allowing Gabriel to continue down a dangerous path? And, more than that, how could she ensure that her help would be lasting? Mrs. Vera closed her eyes and joined her hands in a silent prayer. Lord, grant me the wisdom to know what to do. I want to help this family, but I don't want to encourage them to depend on others forever. Show me the way. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was one of her neighbors, Mrs. Clarice, a talkative woman who had lived in the same building for years and was always up to date on neighborhood happenings. Although they were friends, Mrs. Vera hesitated before answering. Part of her still wanted to keep what she had discovered a secret. But when she picked up the phone, she heard Clarice's familiar and warm voice. Hi, Vera. How are you, dear? You seem a bit distant lately, commented Clarice. Do you need anything? You know you can count on me. Hi, Clarice, Mrs. Vera replied, forcing a calm tone. Actually, I was thinking about something. I need to talk to someone I trust. Clarice, always curious, encouraged her to speak, and then Mrs. Vera poured her heart out. She told her about the boy she'd seen at the market, about her visit to Sarah's apartment, about the mother's weakened state, and Gabriel's silent sacrifice. Clarice listened attentively, and at the end of the story, Mrs. Vera sighed, as if finally releasing a burden she had been carrying. So, I'm trying to figure out what I can do, concluded Mrs. Vera, her voice trembling. I want to help, but I don't know where to start. On the other end of the line, Clarice was silent for a few moments, perhaps absorbing the complexity of the situation. But, being a practical woman with a generous heart, she soon responded, Look, Vera, maybe you don't have to do this alone. Why don't we seek help from the community? People are more generous than you might think. I know some ladies from the church who would be touched by this story. And who knows, maybe even Mr. Amilcar from the market might help if he knew the situation. Mrs. Vera frowned. The idea of sharing Sarah and the children's story with more people made her hesitant. She didn't want their dignity to be further hurt, nor did she want them to become a charity case discussed by everyone. However, she recognized the wisdom in Clarice's words. On her own, she wouldn't have the resources to give them the support they needed. Maybe you're right, Clarice, she finally replied. But we have to do this respectfully, you understand? I don't want anyone going there with pity or treating that family as a lost cause. I want them to be helped with dignity. Clarice agreed, and they quickly began to form a plan. They decided to start with a small group, just the neighbors who genuinely cared and could contribute practically and discreetly. Mrs. Vera suggested a small collection of food and clothes, something that could ease Gabriel's burden and ensure he wouldn't need to steal anymore. They also considered involving the local parish priest, known for organizing assistance campaigns for needy families, hoping to secure more structured support. After hanging up the phone, Mrs. Vera felt a slight relief, though her heart was still uneasy. She knew the next step would be to speak with Gabriel and Sarah to explain her intentions. She wanted them to understand that the help wouldn't come as charity, but as support so they could rebuild their lives with dignity. That night, she knelt beside her bed and prayed for strength. She remembered Gabriel's face, his determination to protect his mother and sister, and felt her heart swell with hope. She knew that material help was only part of what he needed. The boy also needed trust and an emotional foundation that would allow him to dream of a better future. Lord, may I be a light in this family's life, and may my help be a path of renewal, not just survival, she whispered. The next morning, She rose with newfound determination. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she felt she was on the right path. The next morning, Mrs. Vera was resolute. She dressed carefully, choosing a light blouse and a necklace she liked, as if going to a special appointment. She knew that this day was different from the others. It was time to confront Gabriel, to speak with him honestly and empathetically, to show him that he didn't have to face the world alone. With a heart full of hope and apprehension, she set off for the little market. She arrived early and positioned herself discreetly near the fruit section, waiting for the boy to arrive. She looked at the packages of apples and bananas, but her mind was elsewhere. While waiting, she imagined what she would say, how she would approach the subject without scaring him. She knew that for Gabriel, the market was a risky territory. Any sign of suspicion might be enough to make him flee. After a few minutes, she saw the small, thin figure entering the door with the same furtive look as always. He walked quickly, almost gliding by the shelves. Without noticing Mrs. Vera, he picked up an apple and a packet of cookies, as if it were a carefully rehearsed ritual. Just as he was about to tuck the packet into his shirt, Mrs. Vera stepped forward and said softly, "Can I talk to you, dear?" Gabriel froze, his eyes wide with fear, and he dropped the packet of cookies, which rolled to her feet. His dark eyes met hers with a mix of dread and distrust. He was ready to run, to disappear before she could call someone or scold him, but something in her gaze made him hesitate. Mrs. Vera bent down to pick up the packet and, with a gentle smile, handed it back to him. "I won't hurt you, son. Nor will I turn you in. I just want to talk, okay?" Gabriel glanced around, as if assessing his escape options. But seeing the kindness in her face, he decided to listen. I'm not doing anything wrong," he murmured, crossing his arms in a defensive gesture. "I was just looking at things." "I know," Mrs. Vera replied, keeping her voice low, as if they were accomplices in a secret. "I know you're getting food for your mother and sister. I saw you all yesterday when I went to your building." Gabriel's eyes widened, surprised and embarrassed. He lowered his face, as if shame weighed on his shoulders. I don't have a choice," he said, his voice choked, but without tears. There was a hardness in his gaze, a determination that made him seem much older than his 10 years. Mrs. Vera crouched down to his level, her eyes meeting his with a warmth he wasn't accustomed to receiving. "I know you're a strong boy, Gabriel, strong and brave, but no one should carry everything alone. You've been taking care of your family in a way many adults couldn't, but now you don't have to do this alone. I'm here to help." He hesitated, looking down at his hands, his fists clenched as if still ready to fight or flee. "I don't want charity. My mom, she always says we have to be strong, that we can't ask for things. And Mr. Amilcar already said we're just trouble for him." "This isn't charity, Gabriel," replied Mrs. Vera, carefully holding one of his hands. "Sometimes, being strong also means accepting the help someone offers us. Your mother is sick, and you're going through a tough time, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve care and support. I want you and your family to be well, to have a life of dignity and peace." Gabriel looked at her, his hardened face beginning to soften, as if he were finally allowing himself to believe her words. "But what if they find out? Mr. Amilcar will be mad. What if he calls the police?" "I already talked to him," Mrs. Vera lied gently, feeling that a little white lie was the best way to calm him at that moment. "He understands that you were doing this out of need. Now we're going to handle everything so that no one else has to worry." He looked down, clearly wrestling with pride and necessity, with the desire to protect his mother and the hope her kindness was beginning to kindle. After a few seconds, he finally murmured, We don't have anyone, you know. My mom is very weak, and my sister, she's always crying from hunger. I don't know what else to do." Mrs. Vera felt her heart tighten, but she kept her gaze firm and consoling. You don't have to know everything, Gabriel. You've done so much already. Now we'll solve this together. I'll come to your house this afternoon and bring food and maybe some clothes. Then I want to talk to your mother, see what more I can do to help her." He looked at her, clearly vulnerable, a glimmer of hope beginning to shine in his eyes. "Do you promise?" Mrs. Vera smiled and squeezed his hand. "I promise, dear. And when we make a promise, we keep it. Tomorrow, you won't need to take anything secretly because your mother and sister will have everything they need." Gabriel took a deep breath, as if processing those words. He nodded slowly, allowing himself to believe, even if only for a moment, that everything could really change. Before leaving the market, he looked at her one last time with a shy smile and murmured, "Thank you, Mrs. Vera. I won't forget this." She watched him leave, the small packet of cookies still in his hands, but this time with a lighter heart. As she saw him turn the corner, she felt that she had taken the first step to rescue not only that family, but also her own faith in the power of kindness and compassion. As she left the market, Mrs. Vera walked back home with renewed determination. She knew there was a long road ahead, that helping Sarah and the children would be a challenge requiring patience and persistence. But as the sunlight warmed her face, she felt that, in some way, she had found a purpose that had been missing for a long time. It was only the beginning, but she was ready. That afternoon, Mrs. Vera arrived at Gabriel's building with a bag full of groceries, clothes, and some blankets. The path to the apartment felt even darker and more claustrophobic, but she continued with firm steps, her heart lightened by a sense of mission. When she knocked on the door, it was Gabriel who answered, with an expression of relief he couldn't hide. Without saying a word, he let her in, and Mrs. Vera noticed that the room was as cold and dark as it had been the last time she was there. Sarah was still lying on the mattress in the corner, the little girl wrapped beside her, playing with the same rag doll. Upon seeing Mrs. Vera, Sarah tried to sit up, an effort that seemed to drain her with each movement. "Mrs. Vera, I don't know how to thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as if each word cost her the little energy she had left. Mrs. Vera approached her, placing the bag beside the improvised bed. "Don't worry about thanking me, Sarah," she replied gently. "I brought some things for you, a bit of food and some clothes that might help with the cold. But more than that, I want to know how I can help you get out of this situation." Sarah looked at her with a mix of relief and shame. I didn't want you to see this, you know? I never wanted to depend on other people's kindness." Mrs. Vera sat beside the mattress, holding Sarah's cold hand. "I understand, dear. We all have our pride, and I respect yours. But sometimes life puts us in situations we can't face alone. And when that happens, there's no shame in accepting someone's help." Sarah lowered her eyes, clearly moved, but seemed to be fighting her own vulnerability. "You don't know how hard I tried, how hard Gabriel tried," she murmured, her voice breaking. "Since their father left, we've been on our own. He left one day and never came back. Gabriel was so young. He couldn't understand why his dad never came home." Gabriel, standing by his mother, looked fixedly at the floor, his fists clenched, as if trying to contain the pain of a wound that had never healed. Mrs. Vera looked at him, her heart aching to see such an adult's sadness in a child. "It was so hard for us," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "At first, I still had a job, could keep the house and support the children. But over time, things got harder. When I got sick, I had to stop working, and without an income, everything fell apart." Mrs. Vera nodded, feeling the weight of this woman's story and her children's as if it were her own burden. She remembered her own youth, the sacrifices her mother made to raise her children alone, and imagined how hard Sarah must have fought before giving in to her situation. Gabriel took a deep breath and, in a faint voice, began to speak without looking at anyone. I tried asking for help. I really did, but people looked at me like I was just a problem. When I realized no one would help, I started taking what we needed. I know it wasn't right, but I couldn't let my mom and sister go hungry. Mrs. Vera felt tears well up in her eyes, but she kept control. She moved closer to Gabriel and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You're a very special boy, Gabriel. Many adults wouldn't have had the courage you've shown to care for your family. But from now on, you don't have to do this alone. Sarah, watching her son, allowed a few tears to roll down her face. I know he's doing the best he can. He's a good boy. He always has been. Even when I didn't have the strength to get up, he got up for me. Sometimes I think he's stronger than I am, she said, her gaze fixed on Gabriel, with a pride mixed with pain and gratitude. But now, I'm here, said Mrs. Vera, her voice firm, and I want to help you find a real way out. You have the right to a dignified life, and I will do everything in my power to make that happen. She took Sarah's hand again, looking into her eyes. Tomorrow, I'll go to the neighborhood church. Father Joachim is a generous person, and he often organizes campaigns to help families in need. I'll also talk to some of my friends, neighbors who can contribute with what you need. And maybe, with a little luck, we can even get medical help for you. Sarah hesitated, but the hopeful look in Gabriel's eyes seemed to spark something in her. I accept your help, Mrs. Vera. Not for what I've lost, but for what I can still offer my children. I don't want Gabriel or little Laura to grow up thinking that the only way out is to steal or hide. I want them to have a chance to dream. Gabriel, with tears in his eyes, held his mother's hand and looked at Mrs. Vera. Thank you. Thank you for not seeing us as a problem. I thought nobody cared. Mrs. Vera smiled, her eyes misty. My dear, every person has worth. Sometimes the world can make us forget that, but never doubt your worth. And as long as I'm around, I promise I'll look after you. She stayed there talking with him, explaining the next steps. With each word, Gabriel and Sarah seemed to relax a bit more, as if the burden they carried was finally beginning to lift. Mrs. Vera knew there was still much to be done, but at that moment, she felt that the first step had already been taken. And that, to her, was a miracle. As she left the apartment, she felt the cool breeze on her face and took a deep breath. Her heart warmed. She knew that from that day on, her life and that of this family were intertwined in a special way. As she walked back home, she felt she had found a mission, a reason to make each day worthwhile. The next morning, Mrs. Vera was more determined than ever. After tidying her own house and saying her morning prayers, she headed to the neighborhood church, a small white-walled parish where Father Joachim held Mass and offered support to those most in need. Father Joachim was a tall man with a warm gaze and a serene voice, always willing to listen and help. Mrs. Vera knew that if anyone could understand what that family was going through, it was him. As she entered the church, she found the priest sitting on one of the pews, silently reading a book. When he saw her, he stood up and greeted her with a warm smile. Mrs. Vera, what a pleasure to see you. Is there something you need, my daughter? He asked, closing his book and gesturing for her to sit beside him. Mrs. Vera sighed and sat down, still holding her purse on her lap. There was something comforting about that place, a sense of peace that seemed to embrace her as she organized her thoughts. Finally, she explained Sarah's situation, Gabriel's courage, and the despair of that family living on the edge of survival. Father Joachim's face showed sadness and concern, but also understanding. He listened intently without interrupting, and when she finished, he placed a gentle hand on hers. It's a painful story, Mrs. Vera, he said softly, but it's precisely for situations like these that we are here. The church has some donations of food and clothes that can help Sarah's family, and I know a volunteer doctor who can visit her to assess her health. I will do whatever I can to help them." Mrs. Vera felt a wave of relief. She knew that the church's support would be essential in truly transforming that family's life. "Thank you so much, Father Joachim. Your help will be a true miracle for them." "There's no need to thank me, Mrs. Vera. In fact, I thank God for people like you, who still care about others and don't turn their backs on those who suffer." The priest smiled and gently squeezed her hand. "But tell me, is there anything else you think they might need? Perhaps something more personal?" Mrs. Vera thought for a moment. Maybe Gabriel needs someone to encourage him to go back to school. He's a smart boy, but he's carried too many responsibilities for his age. And little Laura also needs attention and care. Father Joachim nodded in agreement. "I'll see what we can do. I know some volunteer teachers who offer tutoring. Gabriel could catch up on what he's missed, and maybe even get excited about a more age-appropriate routine." As she left the church, Mrs. Vera felt renewed. With each step, the idea of helping that family was no longer a burden, but a sacred mission, a purpose that inspired her and filled her days with meaning. But there was still something bothering her. She needed to speak with Mr. Amilcar, the market owner, that hardened man who saw Gabriel as nothing more than a misbehaved kid. When she arrived at the market, she found Mr. Amilcar organizing products on the shelves as usual. She greeted him with a nod, and he responded without much enthusiasm, clearly unaware of the purpose of her visit. "Mr. Amilcar, may I speak with you for a moment?" she asked, trying to sound as gentle as possible. He sighed, setting a box aside and looking at her with a curious expression. "Of course, Mrs. Vera. What is it about?" Mrs. Vera took a deep breath and recounted Sarah and her children's story in detail. She spoke of the mother's illness, the father's abandonment, and Gabriel's courage in stealing food only to feed his family. Mr. Amilcar listened silently, his face initially impassive, but as the story unfolded, his expression softened, as if something inside him was breaking. When she finished, he remained silent for a few moments, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if he were processing everything he had heard. Finally, he murmured, I didn't know, Mrs. Vera. You know, we see so many things happening, so many people trying to take advantage, that sometimes we close ourselves off." Mrs. Vera nodded, understanding. "I understand, Mr. Amilcar. It's not easy to see the human side of everything. But Gabriel is just a boy. He's doing what he can to save his family, and I think we can do more than just judge him." Mr. Amilcar sighed, as if releasing an old weight. "You're right. I was hard on him, maybe too hard. And to think he only wanted to feed his mother and sister. I didn't know it was like that." He lowered his eyes for a moment, then, with a deep sigh, looked at Mrs. Vera. "Mrs. Vera, I'll help. I'll send some food to them every week free of charge. And if they need anything else, maybe clothes, I can get some donations from suppliers. The market can help more than I realized." Mrs. Vera's heart warmed at his words. "Thank you so much, Mr. Amilcar. I'm sure they'll feel greatly relieved by your help. Sometimes, all people need is a second chance." As she left the market, Mrs. Vera felt that, little by little, she was building a solid support network for Sarah and her children. Deep down, she knew things wouldn't change overnight, that the pain of abandonment and poverty wouldn't easily disappear. But each act of kindness, each gesture of generosity, was a brick helping to build a better future for them. The next day, along with the church donations and the generous contribution from Mr. Amilcar's market, Mrs. Vera returned to Sarah's small apartment. This time, she brought a true provision: rice, beans, powdered milk, fresh vegetables, and even some hygiene items. When Gabriel opened the door and saw what she had brought, his eyes sparkled, and he could barely contain his excitement. "Mom, look what Mrs. Vera brought," he exclaimed, running to show the bag to Sarah, who was still lying down, but with a smile that lit up her pale face. Mrs. Vera approached and knelt beside Sarah. "This is just a little help. And Sarah, I brought a friend to see you," she said, gesturing to an elderly man waiting at the entrance. It was Dr. Armando, a volunteer doctor from the church who had come to examine Sarah and offer a diagnosis. Sarah looked at Mrs. Vera with unspoken gratitude, her eyes filling with tears. I never thought anyone could care this much about us." Mrs. Vera took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Sometimes God puts people in our path to remind us we're not alone. And your family has many people rooting for you now." While Dr. Armando examined Sarah, Mrs. Vera spoke with Gabriel about the possibility of returning to school and the support he could receive from volunteer teachers. For the first time, she saw a true spark of hope in the boy's eyes, as if he was beginning to believe that life could offer more than just struggle and suffering. By the end of that afternoon, as she left the apartment and watched the sky bathe in orange hues, Mrs. Vera felt a deep sense of peace. Helping Sarah and her children had become not only a mission, but also a source of joy. She knew there was still much work ahead, but for the first time, she felt they were on the right path. And with each act of kindness, hope grew, like a small flame that refused to be extinguished. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to transform quietly. With her determination and generosity, Mrs. Vera inspired a wave of solidarity that gradually spread to more and more neighbors. She knew that Sarah and her children needed more than just temporary help. They needed ongoing support, something that would allow them to rebuild their lives with dignity and security. Slowly, this help started to take shape. Shortly after speaking with Father Joachim and Mr. Amilcar, Mrs. Vera began an informal campaign among the neighborhood residents. Discreetly, she went door to door, talking with neighbors, explaining Sarah's situation, always carefully preserving the family's privacy and dignity. People listened intently. Many moved to hear that, just a few streets away, a young mother and two small children were struggling for survival. The first to respond was Mrs. Clarice, who not only made a generous donation of clothes and food, but also helped spread the word to other neighbors. "People just need to know, Vera," she said enthusiastically. "When we share these stories, we give others a chance to help. We can't solve everything alone, but together we can make a huge difference." In just a few days, more people started to come forward with small contributions. A lady who lived on the corner donated a folding bed so that Sarah no longer had to sleep on an old mattress on the floor. A couple who ran a furniture store donated an old but sturdy wardrobe that could help organize the children's clothes. And everyone who came seemed to bring not just material goods, but a new energy, a collective strength that Sarah and the children desperately needed. Mr. Amilcar, who had initially been reluctant, surprised everyone by taking the lead in the campaign at the market. He placed a box at the entrance with a small handwritten sign, "Help a family in need." Donate food, clothes, or whatever you can. Whenever a customer asked about the box, he shared Gabriel and his mother's story with a simplicity and empathy that no one expected from him. Some customers, moved by the story, began adding more items to their shopping list to donate, and soon the box was always full. Bags of rice, beans, powdered milk, packets of cookies, and even toys for Laura, who gradually began to show a shy smile as if rediscovering the joy of being a child. Every time Mrs. Vera brought donations to Sarah's apartment, the reaction was one of deep gratitude. Sarah, still weak, looked at each item with tearful eyes, as if every small donation was a gift she had never imagined receiving. Gabriel, on the other hand, was less concerned about the food, but there was one thing that filled him with hope: Mrs. Vera's words about school. After a few conversations, Gabriel finally accepted the idea of going back to his studies. Father Joachim managed to enroll him in a nearby public school, And with the help of some neighbors, Mrs. Vera provided notebooks, pencils, and even a new backpack. The day he received the supplies, Gabriel looked at Mrs. Vera with a genuine smile and said, "I'll work hard, Mrs. Vera. I don't want to disappoint you." She hugged him, moved. "You could never disappoint me, Gabriel. All I want is for you to have the chance to be the boy you deserve to be, with dreams and opportunities. And now you will." As the weeks passed, Sarah's health also began to improve. Dr. Armando, the church's volunteer doctor, continued to visit her regularly, and with the right medications and better nutrition, she started to regain her strength. One day, sitting on the bed, she looked at Mrs. Vera and murmured with emotion in her voice, "Mrs. Vera, I don't even know what to say. You and these people have saved my life. I thought I would die and leave my children alone. But now, for the first time in months, I feel we might have a future." Mrs. Vera squeezed her hand and replied lovingly, "We're all here for that, my dear. We all need each other at some point. And helping your family has only brought more meaning to our lives." Inspired by Sarah's determination, Mrs. Vera went even further. She spoke with an acquaintance, Mrs. Lourdes, who worked at a local NGO that helped vulnerable women find employment. Mrs. Lourdes, touched by Sarah's story, offered her a spot in a small sewing course held in partnership with the church. When Sarah heard about the opportunity, she was overjoyed. Although still weak, seeing a possibility for work filled her eyes with hope. "I've always loved sewing," she confided to Mrs. Vera. "Before I got sick, I made clothes for the kids and even earned a little money. Maybe now I can do it again. Help my children without having to depend on others." Mrs. Vera smiled, touched. "That's exactly what we want for you, Sarah. For you to have the tools to rebuild your life. We're all here to help you get up, but after that, you'll be able to walk on your own." Gradually, the community united in a solid and almost organic way. Whenever someone had a need, the group of neighbors would organize a small fundraiser to ensure nothing was lacking. Mrs. Vera, unintentionally, had become the leader of this chain of kindness, a sort of matriarch of a neighborhood renewed by compassion. And so, Sarah's apartment, once a place of despair and darkness, began to fill with little lights. The bed, the wardrobe, the carefully hung clothes, the food stored in the cabinets, all of it represented a new beginning, a symbol of restored dignity. One night, when Sarah sewed her first piece, a simple dish towel with hand embroidery, she called Gabriel and Laura to show them, her eyes shining. "It's simple, but it's the beginning of our future," she said, emotional. And Gabriel, holding the dish towel as if it were a work of art, smiled and hugged her tightly. Mrs. Vera, who had been invited to see Sarah's first piece of work, watched the scene with a warm heart. She felt grateful for listening to the call of her heart that first time, for following the instinct to help rather than judge. As she was leaving, Gabriel walked her to the door, and before she stepped out, he quietly said, "Mrs. Vera, thank you for not giving up on me, on us." She hugged him, feeling tears welling up. "My dear, when you help someone, you transform yourself too. You and your family have given me a new reason to live, to believe that the world can be a better place. Your family is already a part of mine." Leaving the building that evening, Mrs. Vera realized she had not only transformed a family's life, but had also brought the entire community together in a chain of love and solidarity. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood seemed brighter, a place where everyone, through small acts, was helping to build a more just and compassionate world. The morning sun entered through the windows of Sarah's small apartment, bathing it in a gentle light. The old mattress on the floor had been replaced by a simple but comfortable bed with clean sheets and a warm blanket. The apartment, once empty and gloomy, now radiated warmth and welcome. There was a small table in the corner with a few chairs donated by the community, and shelves where Sarah carefully kept her first sewing projects. Mrs. Vera arrived early, bringing a container of homemade soup for Sarah and some fruit for the children. Gabriel greeted her at the door with a shy smile, which had gradually replaced the wary, hardened look he'd had at first. He seemed different, standing taller, with an expression of relief that moved her. "Good morning, dear," said Mrs. Vera, handing him the bag with the soup. "How are you all today?" "We're fine, Mrs. Vera. My mother is much better, and so am I," he replied, trying to hide the joy lighting up his face. Gabriel, who had agreed weeks ago to return to school, was already showing progress in his studies, and his curiosity and intelligence were catching the teacher's attention. As she entered the apartment, Mrs. Vera saw Sarah sitting at the table with a welcoming smile. She looked like a different person, still thin, but with a light in her. Eyes that illness and hardship had extinguished for so long. In front of her were some colorful fabrics and a small piece of children's clothing that she was sewing with care. "Sarah, it's wonderful to see you like this," Mrs. Vera said, moved as she observed the small steps that together were forming a new life. "Thanks to you, Mrs. Vera," Sarah replied, looking at her with gratitude. "And thanks to everyone in the neighborhood. I never imagined so many people would care about us. But now I feel like we're not alone." Mrs. Vera smiled, firmly holding her hand. "You will never be alone again. You're part of this community, and the community is stronger when we all look after each other." Little Laura, who was playing on the floor with her rag doll, now dressed in new clothes, stood up and ran into Mrs. Vera's arms. "Grandma Vera," she said with an innocent smile. The word took her by surprise, and Mrs. Vera's heart beat fast, suddenly feeling like a real grandmother. She smiled, stroking the girl's hair. "Grandma Vera? Is that what you're calling me now, my dear?" Mrs. Vera asked, her eyes bright with emotion. Laura nodded, clinging to her neck, and Sarah looked at the scene with a loving smile. "You really are like a grandmother to them," said Sarah. "To all of us." Mrs. Vera felt tears threaten to spill over, but she took a deep breath and smiled. "Well, I suppose I've been promoted, and as a good grandmother, I promise to always be around to take care of you." That day, Sarah shared something special. With the help of the church and the local NGO, she had been invited to join a group of seamstresses who sold clothes and embroidered items to support vulnerable families. She was still learning, but she showed great talent, and the work gave her not only an income, but also a sense of purpose and independence. "It's a new beginning, Mrs. Vera," she said, her eyes shining. "I never thought I'd be able to work again, to be independent. It's still small, but it's more than enough for me, for us." Gabriel, who had listened in silence, looked at his mother with pride. "I want to be as strong as you, Mom," he said, his voice filled with admiration. And Sarah, moved, pulled him into a hug. "You're already strong, my son," she replied, kissing his forehead. "Stronger than I ever imagined." Mrs. Vera watched the scene, her heart overflowing with joy and peace. That moment was the culmination of everything she had worked for over the past weeks. And more than anything, it represented the power of love, compassion, and hope. Before leaving, Gabriel walked her to the door. He paused for a moment, looking at her with a shy but resolute smile. "Mrs. Vera, I wanted to say something," he began, his voice a little shaky. "Of course, my dear," she replied, leaning slightly to meet his gaze. "You can say whatever you want. I just wanted to thank you, truly, for everything, for not giving up on us, for helping us have a new chance. You showed me that we don't have to face everything alone, that there are good people out there." He paused, searching for the right words. "You gave me new hope." Mrs. Vera, her eyes moist, hugged him warmly. "You don't need to thank me, Gabriel. Everything I did from the heart. And know that the strength you've shown, the courage to care for your mother and sister, has inspired me. You are an extraordinary boy. And now, with all of us here to help, You can be whoever you want. You can dream." Gabriel nodded, and they stayed in each other's arms for a moment, needing no more words. Mrs. Vera knew he would be a different boy now, carrying a mark of resilience and love in his heart that would never fade. When Mrs. Vera left Sarah's apartment that day, the entire neighborhood seemed different. The sun illuminated the streets with new intensity, and those who knew her greeted her with warm smiles and nods. She had not only helped a family in need, but had also planted a seed of solidarity and empathy in the whole community. Mr. Amilcar's little market had now become a meeting point for those who wanted to help, and the church organized support groups for several families in the area. Mrs. Vera's genuine kindness, the warmth with which she cared for Gabriel, Sarah, and Laura, had transformed everyone. The neighborhood had become a more humane, more united place. That night, as she lay down, Mrs. Vera reflected on everything that had happened. She felt a deep peace, as if her own life had gained a new meaning. She closed her eyes, and in her final words before drifting off to sleep, she offered a silent prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the strength to listen to my heart and for allowing me to be part of this family's life. May I always be a light for those in need, and may the love we spread grow even more." And so, the neighborhood, once just a collection of houses and distant neighbors, became a home where each person looked out for the other. Because, as Mrs. Vera learned and taught, when we look at others with compassion, we can transform the reality around us. Kindness is a beacon, not only illuminating those who are lost, but also guiding the steps of the one who lights it. The story of Sarah, Gabriel, Laura, and Mrs. Vera became a living lesson for everyone, a reminder that love and solidarity can indeed work miracles. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.